So I think we can start. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Welcome to LSE for this evening's hybrid event, which is part of the LSE Festival, Power and Politics. And as you might already know, the events for LSE Festival are taking place throughout the week until Saturday. The events, including our panel, would be discussing how power and politics shape our world. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy. I am Professor of European Politics and the Chair in Contemporary Turkish Studies at the European Institute. I'm very pleased here to welcome Professor Chris Alden, Dr. Yolanda Spies, and Dr. Bugra Susler to both our online audience and to our audience here. Let me briefly introduce them in the order that they will initially speak today. Chris Alden is Professor of International Relations and Director of LSE Ideas. His publications include the co-authored books, The South in World Politics and Foreign Policy Analysis, New Approaches, which is now in its second edition. And as you can see, the books are very relevant for the topic that we will be discussing today. Similarly, Yolanda Spies is the director of the Diplomatic Studies program at Oxford University. She served as a South African diplomat for 18 years, then switched to academia in 2005. She is the author of Global Diplomacy and International Society and Global South Perspectives Global South Perspectives on Diplomacy. And our last speaker will be Dr. Bugra Susler, who is lecturer in the UCL Department of Political Science and the head of Turkey and the World Program at LSE Ideas. He is the author of Turkey, the EU and the Middle East, Foreign Policy Cooperation and the Arab Uprisings. Today, our speakers will explore how global middle powers exert their influence in their regions and on the global stage. We will discuss the diverse perspectives of middle powers on pressing global issues and their various visions on the future of the international system. Our main focus will be South Africa and Turkey, with implications obviously for non-Western powers we would not normally label or describe as superpowers. For those social media users in the audience and online, the hashtags for today's events are LSE Turkey and LSE Festival. I would ask you to please put your phones on silent so that you don't accidentally disrupt the event. And please also be mindful of the fact that the event is being recorded, and we will try to make it available as a podcast and as a video later on. After the initial interventions of our speakers, for about 5 to 7 minutes each of them, there will be a chance for you to ask your questions to them. If you are watching us online, you can use the Q&A function and pose your question. Please remember to state your name and affiliation. And for those of you who are in the theater with us, after the initial interventions, I will open the floor to questions. And please wait for the roving mic and raise your hand, and I will give the floor to you to ask your question. I will try to ensure to get a range of questions from online and from the theater. So if I cannot actually give everyone a chance to speak today, I apologize in advance. Without further ado, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I guess it is on, and great to be here. I'm going to talk about sort of theories of middle powers and sort of give a context for it and a few pointers and discuss how middle power theory illuminates certain aspects of the conduct of states that characterize themselves this way, but it neglects structures of systemic factors. And if we bring those in, we get a very different or somewhat different picture of middle powers. Okay, so, I mean, the classic work on middle powers is fitted within a power hierarchy, right? It's fitted within a world where principally material attributes are the main guide and thing of consequence in terms of distribution of power. So states are smaller size, territorially, demographically, insignificance in this hierarchical view. The term middle power is a 20th century term. We begin to see it in the literature building, interestingly enough, at the same time as the League of Nations was founded. Okay, and they started to talk about the middle powers, the powers that were smaller than the great powers, basically, and recognizing that on the international stage they were doing things that were which supported institutions, the League, and/or the component parts of that system, and the same sort of language and identification was brought forward when the United Nations system post 1945. Interestingly enough, 1945 to 1947, let's say, to the end of the Cold War, middle powers were present, but the theory of middle powerdom did not advance. It was only in the aftermath of the Cold War that we see some real creative thinking around that. Cooper, Higgett, and Nozzle, amongst others, talked about middle powers as powers which they're self-identified as such. They recognize themselves. They have some material capabilities, but certainly less than great powers, right, or superpowers. And in that context, what they do is three things. They're bridge builders, natural, between regions or between contesting actors, state actors generally, but not exclusively. They're multilateralists, like their precursors in the League and in the United Nations. They sort of inhabit that world of international law, sovereign equality of states, and they want to support and bolster and amplify their foreign policy through use of international law and the institutions associated with it. They pursue niche diplomacy. Because their capabilities are not global, they tend to focus on an area where they have some perhaps regional expertise, or perhaps it's ideational in some way. They're a democracy and they see themselves, or they're an Islamic state and they see themselves inhabiting a particular role within that. So all of these things are niche diplomacy, and sometimes they're niche in terms of method. So they're mediators, or they engage in trade. They pursue particular trade issues. Canada and Australia as great grain producers, for instance, in the late 80s and 1990s, were championing the voices of the non-superpowers of agricultural trade. So those sort of things. They're coalition builders and sometimes parts of alliances. But I think the key factor, and this is from Nozzle and Cooper and the like, is that they are systems. They fall within a leadership-followership relationship. That you've got leaders defining the system, a hegemon, if you want to look at it through that lens, and middle powers are positioned within that as, if you like, the carriers of some of the values of multilateralism, liberal in this particular case, right, because of the unipolar moment and the dominance of and emergence of the liberal international post-Cold War, and they use that position to promote values. And I think I need to go faster. Quickly, an example of that would be Norway. Okay, Norway used its power to go out and position itself as a broker on conflict. Okay, and particularly we know about the Oslo Accords. We know about, you may know about Sudan, Angola, Sri Lanka. These are all places where conflicts in the early part of the post-Cold War period, where they invested in and put resources towards solving them. I suppose we do know about this now, but Qatar foreign policy very much modeled itself on Norway. Just a quote from the Emir in 2014, just like Norway, we are determined to be a force for good in the world and to play an active role in promoting peace. They quite consciously looked to the Norwegians and to some extent even borrowed from them to develop a position within the Middle East politics, and we see it playing out to this day. The last points I want to make. Looking at middle powers, that theory, you will note, occurs in the unipolar moment, in the settled liberal international in the post-Cold War era. We're moving into a new era. A couple of things that are at play which change that. One is in moving from unipolarity to what seems to be a multipolar environment. How do middle power, where do they sit in this? How do they fit in all of this? I put forward the idea that, in fact, it's an international system of variability, maybe lifting from Barry Buzan's regional security complexes. So we'll have different regions, the European Union area or Europe, as having a certain set of institutional dynamics and cohesion. Other parts maybe Central Africa or parts of let's say, the Central Asia may not have, they have a different logic and different set of institutions and the like. And as we move increasingly towards a diffusion of power across regions, middle powers will become more regional. Some of them already are, but their ability to act will in an era when multilateralism is under assault, will be less. So the middle power may have a stronger commitment to or draw from more localized resources, power positions within that. So I think that I have to stop there, but I'll come back to some of these later.
Thank you. And we will have plenty of time for discussion. Thank you very much for that short intervention. And Yolanda, the floor is yours. Is the microphone not working?
I'm going to borrow this one. Okay. Good evening. It is enjoyed the conceptual overview that Chris provided, because he emphasized the idea that middle powers are the good citizens of the world. They are the ones that project an image of healing, bridging, bringing together. That's why they are leaders in multilateral domains. And something I'd like to add to that is the fact that middle powers prioritize diplomacy over military means. So a middle power who identifies strongly as a middle power will typically invest more in their diplomatic infrastructure than they would in their military infrastructure. South Africa has just gone through an election, as many other countries have or are going to this year. And it was a startling reminder of just how diverse and complex our society is. It reminded many of us, including me, who lined up in London for 6 hours just to cast my vote, of 30 years ago, 1994, when we transitioned to full democracy. And just like 30 years ago, we are again looking at an uncertain future. We have absolutely no idea how this new government will behave. In fact, the new government has not been formed yet. There was no outright majority for any party, and coalitions are on the table, potentially a government of national unity. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because foreign policy is formulated by governments, and because South Africa's foreign policy after this election might just look a little bit different from what it has up till now. Why? Because for 30 years we had one single majority party in power, and our foreign policy was done through the prism of their party political positions. 2 years ago, I contributed to an edited volume called Awkward Powers, Gabriel Abundanza was one of the co-editors of that, and they looked at middle power and great power theory, and they said it just doesn't apply so neatly, so elegantly in all cases. Because ever since the end of the Cold War, certain countries have started to behave like middle powers, but not consistently so. And South Africa is one of them. So when we had our transition to democracy, 1994, immediately we were the flavor of the world. We were welcome everywhere. We took leadership. We engineered the OAU's transition into the African Union. We were a founding member, a leader in orchestrating the establishment of the International Criminal Court through the Rome Statute in 1998. We became an expert in the niche diplomacy that Chris referenced, for example, in nuclear non-proliferation negotiations, and we were celebrated. However, about a decade or so ago, we started floundering, and this could perhaps be tied to the fact that our government went into a crisis of governance. We had massive corruption, and that partly led to the ruling party now losing its outright majority. But be that as it may, South Africa was still punching above its weight, partially because it is such a hegemon within Africa. And for that reason, South Africa was chosen to be the only African member of the G20 until last year, when the G20 admitted the African Union as a member, as it had previously admitted the European Union. So South Africa, whatever we did wrong or right, we were seen as a bridge builder and a leader in multilateral forums. But I'm going to give you just one example, because I don't have time now for more than that, of how South Africa has been equivocal, a little bit confusing in the way it acted as middle power. I mentioned that we were one of the pioneers that established the International Criminal Court. And you may know that the International Criminal Court has unprecedented jurisdiction over prosecution of individual politicians who presided over things like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or crimes of aggression. And yet South Africa fell into disfavor. Why? Because it refused to implement some of the decisions of the International Criminal Court. Our government refused to arrest Omar al-Bashir, dictator from Sudan, who had presided over genocide. It was even called that by the UN Security Council in Darfur, which at the moment, again, well, still is in dire straits and deserve all possible international attention. And the South African government refused to arrest Omar al-Bashir when he visited South Africa with an arrest warrant issued for him. And when our own courts challenged that decision, the South African government facilitated his exit from the country. Last year again, big brouhaha. South Africa hosted the BRICS summit. And of course, Vladimir Putin was invited, and of course, the ICC had already issued an arrest warrant for him too. Fortunately for South Africa, he did not attend, because that would have been another mess. Now, here is the contradiction. You will know that South Africa has a case before the International Court of Justice, taking Israel to this court, this centerpiece of the United Nations, for the crime of genocide. And in this sense, South Africa has taken leadership that was not done by a range of other middle powers with better credentials, states closer to the region, and has garnered enormous international support for this effort. And I must say that I'm one of the people who was just completely gobsmacked at how successful this was as a niche form of diplomacy, which I call judicial diplomacy. The International Court of Justice is, in the first place, a diplomatic arena. All members of the United Nations, all member states are automatically members. And the judges are selected by the UN General Assembly. So by doing this, and doing it in such a timely fashion, South Africa really grasped the moment and clawed back some of its lost stature at middle power credentials. I'm going to leave it right there. I'm out of time.
Perfect. Perfect.
You can ask questions on it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Bugra.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So I'm going to mainly cover Turkey and how Turkey fits into this debate on middle powers and the changing world order. As the world becomes more multi-centered, it's important to consider the perspectives and policies and views of emerging powers that are pursuing influence, both in regional and in global politics. But much of the debate around the international system and changes in the international system that revolves around the rise of China and the implications of the rise of China, US-China competition, while smaller emerging powers, they receive much less attention. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine showed the return to prominence of great power politics, with increasing contestation between a US-led Western alliance and a Russia-China bloc. And there was a sense of unity among Western democracies after the invasion, but their expectations of a global and unified condemnation of Russia were unmet because many states in the global south, they did not follow Western positions. But at the same time, we have seen a group of middle powers like Turkey, South Africa, Indonesia, responding in a similar way, and they have adopted what they term bridging or balancing policies between the West and Russia. And because of this, they have been framed sometimes as fence-sitters or swing states. Turkey is an example. Again, it provided Ukraine with military support, including drones, but at the same time refused to put sanctions on Russia. So these middle powers have also sought to take on mediatory roles in trying to position themselves as mediators in the conflict, as bridge builders. South Africa, for example, argued that it could be a reliable mediator as a member of BRICS, and South African president led a delegation of African leaders to Russia and Ukraine. And most notably, Turkey played a key role in the grain deal, the deal which allowed Ukraine to export grain across the Black Sea, but also in other initiatives, such as the deal which allowed prisoner exchanges. So what the war in Ukraine has shown is that while major powers compete, and they try to shape the structural context, they increasingly have to pay more attention to the interests and views of those middle powers that lie in between. So in terms of the literature, in the classic literature on middle powers, traditional or established middle powers, are described usually as liberal and stable democracies in their domestic affairs, but also stabilizers and promoters of the liberal international system in their foreign policies. And more recent scholarship draws a distinction between established middle powers and emerging middle powers, describing emerging ones as those who have assumed internationalist postures in the post-Cold War era. They may face domestic problems with development, democratization, and most importantly, they might be hesitant to promote liberal internationalism. They often exhibit behavior that can be framed as systemic contestation, which sometimes arises from a pursuit of status in the international system, so they would like more say in the international system. So Turkey is a good case of an emerging middle power because it faces various issues, first of all, in domestic politics, including authoritarian tendencies, but also economic problems. At the same time, it emphasizes this need to pursue more status, attain more status. And this kind of thinking actually predates the ruling government, AKP, and it is closely related to a post-Cold War reorientation, but also reassessment of Turkish foreign policy and Turkey's role in this newly emerging post-Cold War order. And Turkish foreign policymakers have often emphasized this notion of strategic autonomy. It doesn't necessarily mean a move away from the West, but it means a greater emphasis. It means that policy is formulated with a greater emphasis on a Turkey-centric approach, a more autonomous approach, even if that means divergence from Western positions. In regional politics, we have seen Turkey adopting more muscular stance. If you think about how it's been involved in some of the conflicts in the region, like in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh. Ankara also makes a strong emphasis on regional governance. Recently, Turkish Foreign Minister said, we believe in regional solutions to regional problems, referring to Israel-Hamas war. Turkey also shows global ambitions. So Turkish policy shows some signs of global ambitions. It's involved in multilateral forums with emphasis on global governance, like G20, but also MICTA, which stands for Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia. So with specific emphasis on global governance and middle powers. But also, most importantly, Turkey contests power hierarchies of the Western-led liberal international order. And again, Turkey's responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also responses to Israel-Hamas conflict and war, show how Turkey can diverge from Western positions. And Erdogan's slogan of the world is greater than five, referring to the permanent members of the UN Security Council, that encapsulates Turkey's critique as well as a desire to attain higher status. This contestation also is reflected on Turkey's relations with its Western allies, for example, its relationship with the EU. This rhetoric of double standards is usually used. Erdogan mentioned he wanted Turkey to join Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Recently, Turkish Foreign Minister said they would like to join BRICS, which reflects not only the pursuit of influence, but also a reaction to the loss of momentum in Turkey-EU relations and reaction to Turkey's relations with the West. So in terms of future trajectory, I don't foresee major changes in Turkey's relationship with the West. Ankara needs more economic stability, it needs more investments, it needs international markets to return to Turkey, which might also mean increased cooperation with some of Turkey's eastern allies like China. But I would expect this emphasis on strategic autonomy to continue, that this balancing approach between the East and the West. Just to conclude very briefly, thinking about the broader context of changing world order, I think questions around alignments, balancing, alignments, non-alignments, they're not entirely new. So one can think about the Cold War and how middle powers in the global South, how they were strategically using their alignments to navigate the security environment, and even sometimes trying to decrease tensions between dominant powers. However, back in the Cold War, they did not have as much material capability as they do now. So arguably, emerging middle powers have more agency in global politics today, and also ability to project power, especially in regional politics. So if we're moving towards this multipolar, or others might call multiplex world order, where you have a proliferation of influential actors, then it's important to examine the perspectives and interests of emerging powers, and also the agency that they can enact in world politics.
Perfect. Thank you very much. On time. You just made my job much easier. We are now going to open the floor to questions from the audience, both here and online. Perhaps in the first round, I'm going to take only 2 questions and give the opportunity to speakers to respond to one another. You can type your questions to the Q&A box, and we will try to answer as many as possible. Please state your name and affiliation. First, please, if you can wait for the roving mic, we'll take a question from there. And then from you at the back, yeah? But first, please.
Hi, I'm Leonie. I'm a current master's student at LSE. Could you please speak to the potential effect of the force of or motivation for deglobalization on the security and stability of current or emerging middle powers?
Okay, great. Please.
I want to know from South Africa and Turkey, since they're represented here. South Africa's a double standard that they condemn Israel,
for its conduct in a war and not Putin's Russia, which I suspect goes back to when they were pro-communist and pro-Soviet Union, and they sort of have a love relationship with Russia. And Turkey makes judgments on the Israel war while they illegally occupy half of Cyprus. I just wanted a response to those actions and behaviours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's also one online question that I want to ask. So, for instance, this is a definitional question, I guess, like what we would categorize as a middle power and not. So the question is, there is unfortunately no name. Give some specifics about the UK as a middle power and whether or not you think the UK is a middle power. So how we would categorize these countries. So shall we start in the order that you spoke?
May we just answer certain questions?
I
Because
think
then we
it's
all
possible,
don't
yeah.
have to do everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think the first one I can speak to, deglobalization. I think there's several impacts unfolding. One of them is that this phenomena of friendshoring, as they sometimes call it, the rising tariff barriers and trade redirection towards states that are seen to be allies or if not security allies, but allies in outlook, is reconfiguring the geography. So I mentioned regional security complexes, but I think that included in that is also an economic form of this, and it is rewriting and strengthening a new political economy. Middle powers in that setting are possibly well placed. Look, a country that is not always recognized by many as a country, Taiwan, and its central position within the production of microchips. So friendshoring and the like is going to bolster its position and its ability to influence its circumstances and what have you. We're already seeing that, but there are other cases like that. So I think it's to summarize, I think that what it's doing is we're seeing a variable geography around the logic of friendshoring as we deglobalize. So tariff preferences and trade preferences are now going to give certain powers within the system, certain economic powers, a heightened position. It may cause others that were once higher up the chain to fall away a bit as well.
Okay. Great. Yolanda?
Yes. To the speaker who asked the question about South Africa's double standards, I can sense that you have strong emotions about this, and definitely.
My wife is Polish, and Ukraine was violated just as Gaza was. I just want to know why you don't put Putin on trial for genocide in the same way.
I completely understand. I completely understand what your question is. You'll recall that I said these positions were heavily dominated by the fact that South Africa had a single majority party in rule since 1994. And as you pointed out, that party had historical relations with certain powers, especially during the Cold War, and created certain ideological alliances. What I find really ironic is that Ukraine was as much part of the Soviet Union as Russia was. So I find it incongruous that the South African government had such a cozy relationship with Russia, to the effect that the deputy president until recently spent months there getting medical treatment. I am not condoning the discrepancies in the policy that they are proposing. Not at all. In fact, that is why I hesitate to call South Africa a clear-cut case of middle power. That's why the chapter I contributed to awkward powers on South Africa was called the equivocal power, because there are real contradictions there. And just to answer the question on the UK, No, I do not see the UK as a middle power. Why? Because the UK is a nuclear power, because they are a permanent member of the Security Council. In other respects, they have assumed middle power credentials. But Canada historically put itself right in that category of middle power when, even before the UN Security Council was formed, said that it would not want to be a permanent member ever. It wanted to be a middle power. So unless the UK gives up that kind of very cozy hierarchical power, I don't see it really claiming middle power ground.
Okay. Bugra?
Yeah, on Turkey, I'm not sure how to compare Turkish policy in Israel and Hamas war, but also Cyprus. But I do understand the premise of the question, and I would also agree with some of the contradictions in the policies, especially in some of the emerging middle powers. You do have that, but I would say this emphasis on finding regional solutions to regional problems is not just about Israel-Hamas conflict, but also you see that also in territorial disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, that Turkish policy emphasizes that. And I think essentially it comes down to power projection in the Mediterranean, and also how Turkey as a regional power can pursue influence in order to get its positions accepted. Also, one of the reasons, for example, behind Turkey's Africa policy was to get to tell Turkey's story to the world, but also make sure that they can get some friends in UN General Assembly when it comes to issues like the Cyprus dispute. It's a long-standing dispute.
I think actually that when you can't really judge Israel for killing Gazans when your government murdered Greeks. In northern Cyprus, Greeks were murdered; they disappeared. That's fact.
Okay.
So,
All right. So we'll take another round of questions, and please. So the first question over there. Please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Asya. I'm studying at college, but I'm an international student. And with regards to Turkish foreign policy, something that comes up quite often is like the question of how economically developed Turkey actually is. For example, this comes up a lot with Turkey's attempt to join the EU. And with that, I just kind of want to know what you guys think, especially if you look at it from a data perspective. Turkey has a very big divergence in its GDP for purchasing power parity compared to its regular GDP. For example, its GDP per capita PPP is 40,000 USD, almost looks like 10,000 in nominal terms. So it makes it real kind of hard to compare just with the data, how developed economically it is, and how I also want to learn I'm kind of curious what do you guys think about how this affects Turkey's diplomatic foreign policy.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. There was one more question over here, the person with the blue sweatshirt.
Thank you. I am Ahmet Kahraman, and I am a PhD student, political science and IR. My question is about do you think there is a possibility that the United Nations Security Council will expand in favor of middle powers? The day by day, they have a lot of international actors in the international system, but they don't have any authority in the UN system. What do you think of that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So I'll also take 2 questions online, maybe in the other rounds. Yeah. Thank you for your patience. So there's again a question on the UK's role, but I think that has been answered. The second question is, to what extent do you believe emerging middle powers serve their own interests or big power interests? So I guess this question is about if we take the definition of middle powers as, supporting the liberal world order, would that make them actually proxies for superpowers or the US? And then the second question is from Azet Ikram. What can the middle powers do to end the Western farming of the genocide in Gaza as a two-sides Israel-Hamas war? So can the middle powers, other than what South Africa has already done, do anything else to end the war?
You want to go first?
Maybe let's go in the reverse order and start with the question on Turkey. Yeah.
Right. So the question was about economic development. So how developed economically is Turkey, and how does that affect foreign policy? Yeah. So I think one of the reasons why I said emerging middle power again, because these emerging powers they can experience issues with development, and that's again. One of the features of emerging middle powers, and I think right now the economic crisis in Turkey that can also affect Turkish foreign policy. If you look at the way in which, for example, Turkey has been engaging with not only Western allies but also other big actors like China. Recently, Turkish foreign minister was in China, emphasizing strong economic relationships, and that also, I think, drives foreign policy formulations. The idea that Turkey needs investments to deal with the economic crisis in the domestic arena. It needs investments, it needs money, basically, and it needs also friends. It can also mean a softening of tensions between Turkey and the West, because Turkey might, again, soften its approach in order to make sure that international financial markets return back to Turkey. So I think that's the connection we can establish between development and also economic drivers of foreign policy and also the foreign policy orientation.
I'll speak to the question on middle powers and the UN Security Council reform. So the UN Security Council is a product of the end of the Second World War. It is completely incongruous in terms of global distribution of power today. We all know it's supposed to be transformed. The question is how, because nobody can agree on that. And even on the term middle powers, nobody can agree. So there are some countries that everybody agrees looks like a middle power. A country like the Netherlands, for example, the way they behave themselves internationally, very, very typical. Mention a country like Turkey, South Africa, Indonesia, Mexico. People are not sure whether they are middle powers. Now, so interestingly enough, the emerging middle powers, these ones coming from the global south, who style themselves as these good international citizens, but they are still contesting the global order, are precisely the ones who are also very eager to become permanent members of the Security Council. And that is not a typical middle power thing to do. Canada, New Zealand, Netherlands, Sweden, those countries have never said, look, I'm here and able to be a permanent member. South Africa does. India does. Brazil does. So what I'm saying to you is that, first of all, we're not agreed on who middle powers are. Right? And they don't necessarily define themselves as such. But this debate is much, much more complex than a simple choice of, shall we enlarge the Security Council with middle powers? My personal idea is that in practice, the Security Council can no longer do its work without the explicit consent of regional organizations. This is taking back to something that Chris mentioned. You would not have seen the mandate to do an intervention in Libya in 2011 if it wasn't for the Arab League, for example, begging for it and the African Union not having an opinion on it. And by the same token, the Security Council, its permanent five, are so destined to block each other that they only take decisions on areas that are not an automatic threat to their own interests. So in reality, you see the Security Council actually taking fewer and fewer decisions of consequence, and more multilateral entities, especially regional organizations and organizations such as BRICS or G7, actually taking decisions of consequence. So I think the Security Council has become its own enemy in the sense that it cannot agree. And don't fool yourself, there are so many countries in this world who want to see it changed, but the moment you start mentioning names, never, ever. They don't want that. Okay? They know who they don't want there, but in order to agree on who should be there, there is no agreement. Otherwise, it would have happened already. Okay.
I just wanted to pick up on the two themes just for a moment. There's a sort of paradox of emerging powers, which is they may want to challenge or revise the international system, but part of what made them emerging is rapid growth. And that rapid growth produces highly unequal societies. Look at all the ones that we've mentioned, and they're all highly unequal and highly unstable for that reason. And the consequence of that is you've got the premier challenging nations into a system, an international system that's evolving or devolving, and however you care to look at it. And yet their claims may be strong. They have some material basis for it, but they're domestically less and less stable. So it's a volatile kind of combination, I think. I'm sorry, there was another one that I had written some notes, and I can't work out what the question was. But
the question was
powers and Israel.
No, I think there was also a question about whether if the middle powers are supporting the liberal international order, are they kind of supporting the US and the West and superpowers?
Yeah, I think, it's a very classic thing, leadership, followership, and the middle powers were seen to be systems. They're sort of system stabilizers in the unipolar period. They support and follow the interests of, and they pursue those interests in line with stability, which of a particular system, the liberal international order system. As that system unbundles a bit, they're then more caste-free, and it may be that we talked about strategic autonomy. There's also active non-alignment is a policy that's been called for on the part of global South countries. Chile's been a big advocate of this, saying we are interest-based. We don't ally anymore in this confusing and conflicting world that's beginning to shift. So I think that may be one way to look at it.
Okay. So we'll take more questions very patiently. You've been waiting at the very back. Thank you very much. And then I'll take a question from here. Yeah.
Irene, disarmament, but I don't.
Can you please speak a little bit louder?
I'm the LSE, but I work in micro disarmament, and I'm just worried about. I like the comment about the middle countries being more interested in less conflict and less military. So how do you see that being applied? If we try to bypass the Security Council, which are the biggest arms seller in the world. So how would that work, and how do we build that security? Because economics is one thing, but if we don't have security, economic doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sakshi. I'm a master's student here at LSE with the Department of Sociology. I kind of wanted to ask a question about the much argued definition of middle powers, and how does possession of nuclear arms play into it? Like, for example, Pakistan or India, who we might just typically consider middle powers, just by possessing nuclear arms, they are in a different set of league when it comes to armament specifically. So does that necessarily put them or group them together with middle powers, or not really? Or where does nuclear power stand in this?
That's a very good question. I will take a couple of more questions because we have 10 minutes left, and then I will let you choose whichever question you want to answer in the final round. So at the back with the black jacket. Or it was a West, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Suma, I work in the public sector. I had a question about to what extent the sort of multipolar world we're sort of entering into with middle powers, they are becoming more, at least the non-Western middle powers are the ones that we mentioned, are becoming more transactional in terms of what they're looking to get out of the different Western and non-Western blocks, and whether to some extent that's being used to reinforce existing leaders within those countries. So I think of examples in Turkey and India, for example, where you're extracting concessions in order to strengthen your own domestic position. So I just wanted to get a sense of that.
Thank you. One more question from the theater, and then I'll take questions from the online. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Joy, and I am also a postgrad student at LSE. I also wanted to kind of touch on the domestic question and just kind of ask what trends you might see emerging from middle powers in the way that they behave, combined with the protectionism and kind of polarization that we're seeing often domestically.
Okay, great. So I will rephrase the questions a bit that are online. So there's a question from Colin, visitor to LSE from East Midlands. It's the inequality question again, but to what extent do these emerging global powers set a standard or model to others in reducing global inequality? But we can also pose the question in general as well, you know, can we actually regard these middle powers as models for other countries? And there was a question that just got disappeared. So the question was about the future of Israel, but then there was an interesting point in the question that I would like to pose as whether the rise of these middle powers or emerging powers mean the decline of superpowers, colonial states, and what does that mean for the Middle East and for global politics in general? Is there like a relative power balance or imbalance? The rise and fall of middle powers kind of impact global security and politics. So Yolanda, perhaps we change things a little bit for this final round, and you go first.
Okay. I'll start with the question right from the back, this security versus diplomacy choice. I'm a staunch supporter of diplomacy, and middle powers will tell you that an investment in diplomacy is an investment in security. And if I just take, I know that they are a very easy target for criticism because they are the superpower, but the United States, when it invaded Iraq in 2003, did it with its military resources, its overwhelming military resources. If it had invested in even an embassy building there in the years preceding, it could have prevented that war. It could have saved itself enormous expenditure. It is still paying the debts of that invasion, which was deemed to be illegitimate. And middle powers do not necessarily neglect the military establishment, but they believe the military should be used only for peaceful purposes. So they will be contributors, for example, to international peacekeeping operations, or using it to support civil initiatives in humanitarian or natural disasters. So it's not a trade-off. Just a quick comment on the question about middle powers setting an example. The traditional category of middle powers, that was definitely one of the ways that we considered traditional middle powers. They were model citizens of the world. Other states aspire to be as good as they are. That's a normative aspiration. But when it comes to economic development, we're not really bringing that into the normative discussion of middle power behavior. In South Africa's case, we had a much bigger economy relative to Africa in 1994 than we had in 2000. However, our influence was way bigger than it was with our larger economy. Our influence, our gravitas, and also the way that we modeled a democracy in Africa and our behavior on the international stage. So yes, modeling behavior is a big important thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean all aspects of all attributes of your country.
Okay. Yeah. Okay for now. All right. And Bugra?
Yeah. So I'll talk about domestic politics question. I think, yeah, that's an interesting question, but also an important one, especially with regard to emerging middle powers, where you have inequalities in domestic arena, but also economic instability, sometimes problematic democratization experiences. So that's definitely a future or a characteristic of an emerging middle or an emerging power policy. And you can also see populism, again, polarization in the domestic sphere. Again, Turkey can be an example of that. Foreign policies pursued by Turkey, in some of the policies, you will see a lot of divergence also in the domestic arena. If you look at, for example, how Turkey is involved in Libya, you will see that there are, again, differences of views in the domestic arena, so clear divergence of views with regard to, for example, sending troops to the Libyan conflict. So you do see that kind of divisions in the domestic arena, I think, with emerging middle powers. When it comes to military, so I can also say a few things about military, it's projection of power. Again, that's another interesting question, whether having nuclear weapons might be related to the definition of a middle power. So I think, yes, while they emphasize diplomacy, I think some of them do instrumentalize military capacity and also material capability. As you said, I'm not sure whether India would be middle, but also it's quite big, I would say. But
it's awkward.
Yeah, so it's not like Turkey, of course. But at the same time, with regard to Turkey, you do also see the projection of hard power, especially, as I said, the use of drones in Eastern Mediterranean. So this muscular approach where you do rely on, where Ankara relies on projection of hard power also, so not just diplomatic power.
Okay, great. Chris?
Sure, I'll pick up a couple of them. One is around the question of multipolarity and system and middle powers and pursuing a transactional foreign policy. I think what this points to the role of structures of the international system in shaping middle power behavior. And when I think about it, if you go back to the Cold War, right, you had the bipolar system. Most states were operated on one framework or the others. There were middle power dissenters. You take Yugoslavia, for instance. Yugoslavia pulled out and had to navigate a path, and it began to seek out and actively, underwrote part of the founding of the non-aligned movement and sought out like-minded states, India, for a time Indonesia, other states, and built a kind of alternative world order. So if you look at middle powers, they can through alliance structures and the like build at least plausible alternatives to the existing order. Multipolarity, I think transactional is about all you can do in this setting. It's not a settled system yet. A middle power has to look at, it can't even become a proper follower because it doesn't know where the system's going. So I think you'll see this, as we are seeing now, much of that kind of conduct. As it settles maybe into these different multipolar regional centers, we'll probably around a regional hegemon of one kind or another, then we'll see a more settled set of behaviors on the part of middle powers.
All right. Great. I think our time is up. Thank you so much to our speakers for a fascinating discussion. which I hope you all enjoyed. There are lots of more exciting events coming up as part of LSE Festival. Please check it online, or you can also take a program on your way out. If you found this event interesting, please also visit the LSE Contemporary Turkish Studies and LSE Ideas web pages for our research and for our upcoming events next academic year. And the good news, we have complimentary drinks outside, so we can continue the discussion there. Thank you.